Alright, hello everyone. So this video is going to be a bit of a follow-up on the last video that I made, which was called The Herald of Totalitarianism. I'll go ahead and link that below in case you haven't seen it or read the article that it went with. But since the last time that I posted with that particular video and today, we have seen Biden take the step of mandating that every business with 100 employees or more must get their employees vaccinated or else require employees to be tested and show a negative test result before coming into the office every single week. From what we know so far, it seems that the money for those tests will be coming out of the employees' pockets. So in the event that the employee will not get vaccinated, which they can do for free, or will not do testing every single week in order to prove that they supposedly don't have COVID, the business will then either be forced to fire the person or pay $14,000 per violation. So for every employee who does not comply, that they don't fire, they will then have to pay $14,000 for the violations. So I want to discuss this from, again, the philosophical perspective of things. This is not a video about medical advice necessarily. I mean, I'm not going to give you any medical advice because I don't know you and I'm not your doctor. And I'm not you. So I'm not here to give anybody medical advice regardless, either way. What I am here to discuss is, like I said, a follow-up on the discussion that I gave last time about the philosophy behind what's going on and the way that this leads to totalitarianism. And now we have seen Biden take this step towards what is directly an authoritarian and totalitarian measure. It goes entirely against the Constitution. So I want to start out here by talking about the division of authority and what is also termed legally as jurisdiction. So within our federal government, there are three different spheres of jurisdiction. We have Congress, the executive branch or the president, and the Supreme Court or our court systems, which is the judicial branch. So each of those different spheres has their own set of powers and authority, and the other branches are not to infringe upon those. So for example, Congress is the legislative branch, so they can pass laws. The president, however, is the executive branch. He can't pass laws. He can issue executive orders for his own executive branch, so for people with his staff, for example. Constitutionally speaking, he can issue mandates for those individuals, but he cannot constitutionally write executive orders the way that he does today, because an executive order essentially is bypassing the legislative system that we have in place with Congress, and the president is essentially acting the part of the legislative body. He doesn't have the right to do that. Constitutionally, that is not acceptable, and therefore, since he is not abiding by the laws which put him into power, it is wrongful use of authority and therefore tyrannical. But the other branch, for example, the court, they also are not a legislative body, so they cannot turn around and say, well, I know that we're here to be ruling about whether or not this particular law is constitutional. It's not constitutional, but I feel like it should be a law, so therefore I'm going to rule in favor of the government on this one. That would be an abuse of authority by the court, because their particular purview of authority requires that they look at the law, look at the Constitution, and determine whether or not the law is constitutional. And if it is constitutional, then it doesn't matter whether or not they like the law. They have to rule in favor of the government on that one, not in favor of whichever citizen has brought it to the Supreme Court. So that's the court's job. And if they were to step outside of that in the manner that many judicial activists today do, then they're stepping outside of the purview of their authority. And again, it is wrongful and tyrannical behavior because they're acting as though they are outside of the law. Same thing goes if Congress were to try to, take the executive authority, for example, and let's just say the Senate didn't like the law that the House tried to pass, so they just decided they were going to veto it, for example. Or, they tried to take over the authorities and powers of the president as commander-in-chief. That would not be an acceptable use of their authority. They also couldn't step in and act the part of a court when somebody brings a case against them, for example. So there are things that each branch is able to do and things that they are not able to do. And the reason that it was set up with these different jurisdictions of authority was in order to ensure that one branch could not take all of the power and just do whatever they wanted. In essence, it was to avoid having the issue of a tyrant or a king like they had in Britain. So the founders had just come off of dealing with Britain's tyranny and the king there, who essentially chose to act as though he was above the law, which at the time was the Magna Carta and the individual charters that the different colonies had, as well as English law at the time, which was, at that point pretty complex, much like our laws and systems are today. He had chosen to exceed his ability and his power within those laws and to ignore the rights that the colonies had as British citizens at the time. And that was the whole entire reason that the Revolutionary War even got started, was because the colonies said, no more of your tyranny, you're not treating us like citizens, so when it's convenient for you, you treat us like citizens, for example, requiring us to pay taxes for a war that you started, that we didn't ask you to fight on our behalf. And when it's inconvenient for you, such as representation for that taxation or respecting our rights to have a fair and impartial hearing for charges laid against us, the right to face our accusers, etc. When it is inconvenient for you to respect those rights, you ignore them and you don't treat us like citizens. So essentially, the Declaration of Independence was the colonies declaring to the King of England that we're making the decision for you. You can't seem to decide between whether or not we are citizens who are deserving of all of the rights that any citizen in England would have, or whether we're not citizens and we're a conquered people that you can treat however you want. So we're going to make the decision for you. We are neither. We're not going to be citizens anymore. We're our own independent nation, and if you will not respect that, we will fight you. And essentially the war started because Britain chose to ignore that rightful declaration of we're not citizens anymore because you're not treating us as citizens, you're not giving us the rights that we legally have, so we're declaring our independence. They chose to ignore that, and so the war started. So, in light of that little brief history lesson, that was what they had just finished dealing with when they started talking about the Constitutional Convention and all of the debates that happened. At the same time, too, most of our founders were well versed in history, and they had a classical education, which meant that they would have learned about philosophy and rhetoric, and they would have learned a lot about Rome and Greece and modern countries as well. So not only did they have the example of tyranny in the form of a king, which was why they introduced all the checks and balances that they did, but they also had plenty of historical documentation that they were aware of tyranny by the mob, which was essentially what you had happen in Rome and some of these other places, and in Greece in particular, was that tyranny by the mob ended up resulting in harm to, obviously, the minority that didn't want to go along. So they wanted to prevent either one of those situations, and the division of jurisdiction was one of their ways of doing so, and to make sure that the people were represented, but that a minority or a majority couldn't just overrun everybody, and that you couldn't have tyranny resulting. So, in light of that then, we have Biden at this point, who has now made this mandate regarding vaccinations. And again, this is not medical advice. I believe that you should be allowed to make your own decision on this. And that means that whether you take the vaccine or you don't, you should be allowed to make the decision knowing full well that you're going to bear the consequences for whatever happens. But What I don't believe is that it is acceptable for the President of the United States to step in and do something that goes against the Constitution. Especially something that goes against the Constitution on such a grand scale. It's not even something that's debatable. You can't even sit here and argue, well, it's a gray area. Maybe this is okay. It's not. There is nothing in the Constitution that grants him the power to do this. In fact, there's nothing in the Constitution that even really gives grounds for Congress to make an act like this, in the sense that they cannot regulate things that go on just within the state. In terms of commerce. They can regulate certain things regarding interstate commerce, so commerce that happens between states and across state lines, for example. They could regulate that. So like, for example, if I own a business and I make a sale to you in another state, then at that point, certain things about that sale could be regulated. So, for example, perhaps Congress could make a law that would regulate rules regarding certain things. If, my company, for example, they transport, they're a food supply company, so they transport food across borders between my state and other states in the area. So they have a region that they operate within, and it crosses state lines. So in certain circumstances, Congress can pass laws that regulate certain aspects of the business, but Congress cannot pass a law that regulates something like this, where it's, the individual business dealing with their employees, and it's in one location in the state. Those employees have nothing to do with interstate commerce in that sense. So they don't have the broad-reaching power to just apply interstate commerce laws to whatever they want. And then argue, well, they do business in other states. There are a lot of complex rules. So potentially, you might maybe be able to make some sort of an argument that Congress could enact some sort of a law like this. But a law is very different from a mandate. And so they don't want to make this a permanent law. They're not interested in that. Plus, they probably wouldn't even be able to get that through the Senate and the House right now, because there's too much division point on that. You've got too many people that would not approve of the mandate, even if they approved of the vaccinations themselves. So that would never go through as a law, or at least at this current point in time, it's highly unlikely it would. So instead, the Democrats have decided that since they couldn't get everyone to get vaccinated by essentially giving them a carrot rather than the stick, they're now going to use the stick, and that's coming in the form of these mandates. Mandates which Biden cannot enforce, because not only does he not have the constitutional authority to write executive orders regarding the United States at large, period, but he also doesn't have a right in particular to write this executive order regulating individual businesses, particularly private businesses. We're not even talking about major corporations. We're just talking about private businesses at this point. He has absolutely no right to do that. I think the other thing that we need to be considering too is why he believes that he has the right to do this. He's not even making an argument that it is constitutionally acceptable to take a move which is more or less unprecedented. Certainly we've seen states do stuff like this at the local level, and unless their state constitutions prevent it, there is technically nothing in the Constitution that denies them the right to make mandates regarding many different things, really. They can be taken to court for it, certainly, and there may be reasons why they can't make the particular mandate they want to, but in general, there's not anything that would stop a governor, for example, from passing mandates about certain things. And if you don't like it, then move or sue them. But there's recourse if there's something that you truly believe is not acceptable, or you believe you should be accepted from the mandate. In many states, though, there is still a requirement that for most things it does need to go through the legislative body. And so the governor can't just pass mandates for anything that he can't get passed into law just because he thinks that it should be law. And the same thing goes for the president, even more so because He doesn't have legislative power whatsoever, according to the Constitution, regardless. So there isn't really a precedent for this. And the idea behind it, and essentially I think this is what it boils down to, that people need to understand about this mandate. He made it very clear what this was about. He said this in his speech when he was talking about the situation. Amongst all of the incoherent rhetoric regarding how the vaccines protect people, because on the one hand he's telling you that they do protect you, but at the other hand he's telling you be afraid of your unvaccinated neighbor because they might make you sick. Amidst all of that crazy nonsense, came the line where he said that it isn't about freedom or personal choice. And I ask you, what is more personal than your own health? For anything else, any other issue, even other vaccinations, and even in states where they have very stringent vaccination requirements, we understand that medical treatments and vaccinations are not a one-size-fits-all. The treatment that you give to one patient to deal with an issue could potentially seriously harm or even kill another patient. So as a doctor treating them, you do not treat every single patient as if they are entirely the same. You treat them as unique individuals who each require their own treatment, and in some cases that treatment may be the same thing, in other cases it may not. But in light of that, then, if we understand that no other treatment is considered the same way, a mandate like this is not only unconstitutional, but an irresponsible one to grant, because we're not talking about a mandate where they're giving an exception or exemption methods for whether that is an exemption to respect the First Amendment right to free exercise of religion and not to have the government force on you either a religion of any sort or the removal of it. We understand that the First Amendment provides very broad protections for the free exercise of religion and for religious beliefs. And while these days the court usually acts as though that free exercise clause somehow is reversed to apply to us, in the sense of you can't, because Congress cannot establish any state religion, then the individual should not be allowed. Then they apply it to the general population and say that religion should not be allowed in the public sphere. Despite the fact that that is how most of the time the court has applied that in the last 50 years or so. That is never how that was intended. That clause is intended, that First Amendment was intended to protect people from a state religion or whether that's atheism, which is in and of itself a belief and a faith, because we cannot prove the existence of, we can't prove the non-existence of God any more than we can conclusively prove that there is a God. Either one of those requires you to have faith. We can argue about how much faith is required to believe in either one of those things, but certainly both of them require faith in order to believe either of them, because you cannot objectively show that there is or isn't one. So if both of them require faith, then requiring people to abandon their faith in favor of atheism or no faith would essentially still fall under this. So when it comes to most mandates regarding this, usually there is a religious exemption, because you have to respect people's religious beliefs even if you don't agree with them. Understanding, of course, that if something bad happens, that is on that person and it is their own fault for whatever has occurred. So whether it is religious exemptions or medical exemptions, because we understand that not everybody can be treated the same way, ordinarily there is some form of exemption. And under most medical ethics codes, there is required to be an option to either receive a treatment or a medication or not, regardless of the advisability of the situation. Biden's mandate would allow for none of those things. So not only is it unconstitutional, but it is also unwise, because it is demanding that everybody be treated the same way regardless of their situation, medically certainly, and it also violates the constitutional right to free exercise of religion, which, whether you like it or not, would allow somebody who has a strong religious conviction on the issue to refuse it, and rightfully so. I mean, you would not want to be forced to take something, or not, let's put it this way, you would, if you believe that you should take the vaccine, you would not want to be told you're not allowed to take it because I don't think that your convictions on the matter are important enough to allow you the option to get it. So in the same reverse, then, we cannot look at people and say, well, I think you should get it, and so your conviction that it would be harmful to you, or that it goes against your conscience and your firmly held religious beliefs, I don't think those are important enough, so my will should be imposed over yours, because that's what it boils down to. What it boils down to is, I think this is what's best for you, and I know better than you do what's best for you, so I feel justified in using a stick to beat you over the head until you do what I think you should do. So I have two messages that I want to give here, now that we've kind of broken down the fact that it's not constitutional. He does not have the authority or the jurisdiction to do this. Even if the local level arguably did, he doesn't have the jurisdiction to do this. So he should be sued for it, and it should be dealt with. It is absolutely 100% a freedom issue. This is just more of the same stuff that I was warning people about in my last video, where I said that we should, that the whole entire COVID crisis has been used in order to push down top-down control over the top, oftentimes, of the science, over the top of what scientific studies actually show, over the top of scientific knowledge we already had, which has not been disproven at this point. Fear has been used as a tool to continue the crisis, to continue to make people afraid, to continue to essentially fearmonger in order to make Americans angry and afraid of each other, rather than allowing them to focus on what the party doing the fearmongering is actually doing. And what they are doing is using it as an excuse to push top-down control and allow them to do things that in no other situation would they ever be allowed to do. In other words, as often we hear, let no good crisis go to waste. Or another saying that sometimes you'll hear in relation to totalitarianism is the idea that, sometimes you've got to crack a few eggs to make an omelet. In other words, the individual and the harm that this might do to them doesn't matter, because society is more important. And what the people at the top think is best cannot be wrong, because they're infallible, obviously. And it doesn't matter that you object, because you're just an individual. And if you object, you're selfish, and you ought to be stopped. That is the philosophy that these people are running on. So this is just one more outpouring, an example of that. And if you go back and watch the other video, if you have not already, in that video I was talking about where all of this leads, and warning people that it doesn't end with this push to get vaccinated. It doesn't end with the requirement that you get tracked in order to do it, or the requirement that you report that you've been vaccinated to your employer or to the government in violation of HIPAA laws. It doesn't end with the requirement that you be vaccinated in order to go on a plane. It doesn't end with the requirement that you vaccinate yourself in order to go into work. It doesn't end here. And the people who are willing to use a legitimate crisis or an engineered one in order to push top-down control and in order to seize power are not going to then turn around and give it up just because the crisis is over. By the time that the people who allowed them to take that power realize what has happened, it's going to be too late to do anything about it. That was the warning that I issued then. And now we have seen that, as predicted, they are going to continue just grabbing more and more and more power, which they have no right to, which they do not have the jurisdiction to take. And Biden is already saying that if Republican governors trying to defend the rights of people to choose what they do with their own health, governors who, by the way, they are encouraging people to get vaccinated. There is not a single Republican governor that I know of at this point who has actually been recommending that people not get it. In fact, most of them have been strongly recommending to people that they get it. Most of them have gotten it themselves. Most of the states that Biden has focused on, whether it's Florida or Texas, not so much Tennessee necessarily, but mainly Texas and Florida, those states have mostly vaccinated their most vulnerable populations. At this point, the governors are struggling with the group of people that don't want to get it. And what they're saying is, you should get it, but we recognize that your health is your responsibility and your choice and no one else's, and therefore we're not going to mandate it. And that is really what they're coming under fire for here. It is not the fact that they're not supporting vaccines. They do. Most of them are encouraging it and have already gotten it. That's not the problem here. The problem here is that they won't mandate it, that they will not force people to do what they're recommending. And that's really what the issue is here. The issue that Biden has with them is that they're not willing to do what he thinks they should and force people to do it. So now, because they wouldn't do that, and because 25% of our population still doesn't want to get it, and by the way, 25% still is heavily made up of the Black community and minorities. Biden and his administration are blaming the conservatives for this, while conveniently ignoring the fact that the population, or the percent of the population that's most resistant to it, tends to majorly be Black Americans, because they don't trust the government. Rightfully so, because they have had issues in the past with the government doing medical experiments, essentially, that resulted in the deaths of different participants from the Black community. I wouldn't trust them either if I had that history. But we can't then turn around and act as if it's all conservatives, because many of these people are not. So we should understand that that 25% that he is acting as though they're all conservatives, and he's implying that it's all the fault of Republicans and Republican governors. It's not. The only thing that these Republican governors are guilty of is refusing to do what he now has and force people to do something against their will. Something that the government in those Republican states understands is a highly individualized situation, and that people have health reasons why they might not want to get it. It's not always political. It can be issues of just not feeling that it's safe for you, issues of not having enough information and so you want to wait. It could also be issues, in many cases, of health issues where you are extremely vulnerable to a bad reaction to the vaccine because of the underlying health issues that you have. Under Biden's new mandate, there would be no exception for those people. So I have a message for both conservatives and for Democrats. The message to both sides is that this is the hill to die on. Now is the time to stand up. Many of us are facing a very difficult decision at this point. For those of us who haven't gotten vaccinated, we're facing the difficult decision of, do we just capitulate and get the vaccination against our better judgment? Or do we stand our ground and potentially do so at great financial risk to ourselves, because we're probably going to be the ones who have to pay for the tests, and for those of us who cannot afford to do that, we then are now going to lose our jobs. So my message to people is that this is the hill to die on. We need to be defending our Constitution, defending what it actually says, defending the separation of powers that is found in it. And if our elected officials are not going to step in and say, you can't do that because it is not within your sphere of authority, then the last offense that we have is ourselves, we the people, standing up and saying this is unacceptable, this cannot be allowed to continue, this cannot be allowed to happen. And that needs to happen across the political aisle. It doesn't matter what you think in terms of your politics. It doesn't matter whether you agree with the vaccine or don't agree with the vaccine. We need to be uniting on our Constitution, on the common law of the land, and whether we like what it has to say or not, we need to be standing up to defend that in all parts. So for the Republicans out there, be ready to stand. This is not going to be easy, but we have to understand that even though it's difficult to stand, if we don't do it now, we're going to lose the only avenues we have to fight back. If we want to do it non-violently, if we want to do it in the legal means, which we shouldn't be looking to cause a fight or cause problems. But if we want to do it in the legal methods, then we need to be standing up now while we still have those available to us. We are watching the breakdown of our legal system, of our Constitution, and of our rights. And if we don't do anything now while we still can, then we're either not going to be able to do anything at all, or if we do something, it's going to be at great cost, most likely with bloodshed. Because historically that's where this leads, is to patriots having to spill their blood, as Thomas Jefferson once said, water the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots. Essentially, that's what we're going to come to if we don't stand up now. We can't be cowards about this. We can't run away from the fight. Again, if you want to get vaccinated, that's fine. But we need to be standing up and saying no to this. Whether we're vaccinated or not, it doesn't matter. We need to be saying no. To the Democrats, my message to you again is obviously, as I said before, we need to be standing up. I don't care what your politics are. If you believe in this country, if you believe in individual rights and in natural rights, rights that no government has the right to violate or take away, and if you believe in our Constitution, which protects you just as much as it does anyone on the other side of the political aisle, if you believe in that, then you also need to stand. But beyond that, my message to you is much the same as it was in the previous video. This train doesn't end anywhere good. And the people that you put in power now, who are there only for their own gain, seeking for political power and aiming to drive the country into authoritarianism, they are not going to remember you when they get there. If you give them that power now, they are going to use it, and you are not going to get it back. It doesn't matter that the crisis will have passed. This pandemic is not going to last forever. Already, in many places, we're seeing that the Delta peak, it's hit its peak and it's dropping. Experts are predicting that we may be through with this current surge soon. And that's going to happen, but they're not going to release the power that you've given them. If you don't resist this now and you don't fight this, and you continue to hand over your liberties as well as ours, because that's what you're doing right now, by backing these things and by not standing up, regardless of your reason for it. If you don't do something about it now, you're not going to be on the top of the train when the totalitarians come knocking on your door. You won't. There will come a point where you are not willing to go as far as they want you to. And that will be the end. Just like it was the end for all of us, that right now you're throwing under the wheels of that train because you disagree with our politics. The fact of the matter is this. When you cede this sort of authority to a politician, right now it's Biden, that people are backing this mandate and arguing that the federal government should be doing this. You cede this authority now, you allow them to overstep their constitutional bounds, you allow them to tyrannize people into doing what they think is best, whether it is or not. If you allow them to do that, it's not going to be something that's just a one-off thing. And it is not going to remain something that's only Biden. you guys need to understand that once you cede power to politicians, they're going to keep using it, and your political opponents will have access to the same exact power that you have just ceded to your politicians. So if you allow Biden to do this now and you set a precedent that it is acceptable to go outside of the Constitution, to abuse the separation of powers, to abuse the separation between what the federal government can do and what the states can do, if you allow him to do that now, you set that precedent. Do you really think that a Republican president is not going to do the same thing? Really? I mean, we just watched Trump's presidency, and despite the fact that I think that many of the policies that he actually enacted were relatively normal, the fact of the matter remains that there were still things that he did that on constitutional grounds shouldn't really have happened. And obviously you can argue on the executive orders issue that he was just undoing a lot of the things that Obama had already done, and Obama was adding to or undoing things that the president before him had done. All of it was unconstitutional regardless, because they were using legislative power that they didn't have. So we just watched Trump do that. He enacted plenty of executive orders. Biden has now enacted many, many more than Trump ever did. We're not going to see a Republican president not using that authority. If you give the power to one and you normalize it, the next person to come along is going to use it, and it doesn't matter whether they agree with you politically or not, they're going to use it. So if you don't want a Republican to get in there and do these kinds of things, then don't give the power away. And your best argument to retain that power for the states or for the people where it is not granted to either the government federally or at the state level, your best argument against it is the Constitution. It doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you are on. The Constitution is there to protect your rights. Use it. Actually use it. Read it. Know what it actually says. Don't use it in cases where you do not have an actual constitutional ground to argue for some right that you're going to claim. There are plenty of those things that I have seen the left do over the years. We're not going to talk about a bunch of them in this video because that's not the point, but there's plenty of those things that I have seen the left do. There's some of those things I've seen the right try to do too. Don't use the Constitution to defend something that is not actually constitutional. So if it's something that you feel is an overreach of authority, don't use the Constitution as defense for why it shouldn't happen if the Constitution doesn't actually defend it. But if the Constitution does defend the stance and does defend you saying this is unconstitutional, you should be using it. Because that's how we keep our government in line with the Constitution and with our laws. That is how we check their power to ensure that we retain our liberties. So my message to you is, just like with the Republicans, you need to stand up and fight this. It's unconstitutional, it is unacceptable, and it doesn't matter whether you agree with the vaccinations or don't. This is something that you need to be standing on. It is a hill to die on. Get the vaccination if you feel like it's going to protect you and you feel like it is the best decision available to you. If you feel like it's not, then don't. But whether you get it or not should not be the dividing point on whether or not you stand up and say that this can't happen. We all need to be standing up and saying no now, because this is not a power that the president has. It is not a power that he should have. And if we don't stand up now, we're not going to get a chance to later. Don't wait until it makes you uncomfortable to stand up against things that are wrong. Do it when you see it. That's the best protection that we have against this becoming an ongoing issue, is to just stand up on what we know is right, and that requires you to actually know what the law is. And regardless of what a court says, regardless of what legislation is passed, this is the law of the land. Our Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and any other laws that go against it or violate it, especially at the federal level, since the Constitution largely defines what the federal government can and cannot do. Anything that goes against it is an illegitimate and unconstitutional use of authority, so we need to be standing up and we need to be saying no. And we need to do it now. Well, we still can't. So that's my message to you guys. That's my message to everyone really on both sides of the aisle is whatever your reason for staying quiet up until this point, we have hit the point of no return. We can't be staying quiet anymore. So let's unite and let's work together. Let's set aside smaller political differences to focus on defending the rights that leave us free to have a discourse later on about the other smaller issues that we may feel need to be addressed. Because at the end of the day, if we don't defend our rights, then we're going to end up in a political environment where one side no longer has the right to speak in society on any number of issues. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be. That's proven time and again by numerous countries that turned into dictatorships just how dangerous that is. We need to have a society that has the rights for open discourse and the rights for individual responsibility, individual choice, a society that understands that we're responsible for the choices we make and that others are not. We have to defend that before we worry about squabbling over other political issues. Certainly there are other issues that matter, but those other issues will cease to be problems that we can concern ourselves with if we're not free to have those discussions or worry about those discussions. So that's my message, guys. Regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, this is something that needs to be opposed. It needs to be fought. I hope that we'll see companies standing up. I already know that the Daily Wire and the Mises Institute both have put out statements saying that this is, the hill they're willing to stand on and die on, and that they will fight with every legal means available to them, and that they will not just stand down and allow this. I hope that there will be more corporations that do so, but whether they do or not, this is the hill that the American people need to be dying on right now. We need to be saying no more, and we need to put an end to this, regardless of where we stand on the issue of vaccinations in and of itself. That is not more important than defending our rights so that when this is all over and when the crisis is past, we're not finding ourselves living in a world where we no longer have those rights, because the crisis will pass. The issue of needing people to get vaccinated or not vaccinating will become an issue that is a thing of the past, the same as it did for so many other things, where now we have the luxury of being able to argue over whether or not people these days should get something or not get something. But we're not going to have the luxury to have those discussions after this is over if we don't defend the rights that allow us to have them. And so we need to be standing together. Preferably, on the conservative side of things, at least for me, guys, I really would rather work with people on the other side of the aisle to defend our mutual freedoms and have discussions about other big issue type things later after this really major issue is out of the way than I would fight them. But this is definitely the hill I'm going to die on. Whether other people join me or not, I'm going to do my part as an American to protect the freedoms that I have for myself and for my own children someday, because I want to see them be able to grow up in an America where they do have the freedoms that I've grown up with. So whether I have people on either side of the aisle who stand with me or not doesn't matter. This is the hill I will die on. I am willing to sacrifice for this. I'm willing to lose my job if it's necessary, to stand up for our Constitution, to stand up for our country, to stand up for our rights, if that is what it comes to. I hope it won't. I really hope that we start to see people on both sides of the aisle standing up to defend this, because it's an issue that is of mutual interest to both sides. And I hope that in some small way, this video encourages those of you who are kind of hanging in the middle or who are not on the extreme side of the left to start working with those of us on the right who are also, in the middle. We're not extreme right crazies. I know that might be shocking to some people at this point. The media has made it sound like all of us are nuts across the board. We're not. We're just average, everyday Americans who have a lot of the same concerns that you guys do. And we're looking for ways to defend our rights and to live our lives, much like you guys are. So I hope that in some way this does reach you guys. The point here is not to be divisive, but to point out that this is something that we do all have mutual interest in defending, and that it is an issue that should concern all of us because it is a freedom issue. And when a president of the United States gets up and says that this isn't about freedom or personal choice on something as personal as your own individual health and the choices that you make there, that is something that ought to be deeply concerning to everyone across the aisle. So thank you for listening. I hope that in some way this has been encouraging and that it will prove a rallying point or a tipping point for those of you who were unsure about what's going on here. I do encourage everybody to get a copy of the Constitution. I have this one here, which is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. These two documents were extremely foundational, obviously, to our country. So if you are a citizen, you should be reading this. If you're not a citizen, I still encourage you to go ahead and read it if you're trying to understand the arguments that are going on right now surrounding constitutionality of different issues. I've got friends who are in other countries who I've talked with, who it's not always easy to discuss the issue because many of them have not studied our Constitution. But as you can see, this is not a very large book. It's a small book. Both documents are relatively short, guys. So I would encourage anybody who is interested in studying this issue or understanding the discussion surrounding the constitutionality of different laws to definitely go ahead and read the Constitution. At the very least, give it a good read through, maybe read it through twice. It's a little dry, I will warn you of that, but this is the document that guarantees your rights as an American. So reading through the Constitution and the amendments that go with it should be something that all of us are concerned with doing. So yeah, you can find it free online. Definitely invest some time in doing that, regardless of the side of the political aisle that you are on. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you have a great rest of the day or the evening, depending on where you're at, and I will see you next time.